Okay, let's get started. We're here at the end of the conference, and I'd like to bring back something I said at the beginning of the conference. One thing that I really wanted to do was to show you what the best of Singapore had to offer. And I think we're trying to do that. And I think Sonny is one of the best that Singapore has to offer as well. So that's why he's here. Let me do a quick intro of Sonny, and then let him take over. So, Sonny is a homegrown, and that's important for us here in Singapore, homegrown, award-winning illustrator and comic artist, right? He's done great work in the major comic publishing houses, like I said this morning, DC, Marvel, Disney, etc. But the work he's most famous for is up on the wall, up on the screen, and that's the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye, for a number of reasons. But the book, I noticed some of you bought it. I hope you enjoy it. I thoroughly did when it first emerged in 2015. The book takes you through a whirlwind tour of Singapore history, and it also is a tour de force of comic art styles through the ages. Right? But the book is also not without controversy. And I think what Sonny did with this book is challenge what is acceptable and not acceptable as art in Singapore and push the boundaries a little. But doing it in a way that is whimsical. And I think the awards and the accolades attest to that. So without much further ado, I'll leave the mic to Sonny.
Thank you for a very kind introduction. So my name is Sonny, and I'm a cartoonist, and this is probably what I'm most known for these days, the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye. But to begin this talk, I want to look at another story called The Art of Kenny Hu, which appeared in a magazine called 2080. How many of you have read 2080 here? Excellent. It was probably at its heyday in the 80s, and this one was one of the stories from the 80s by T.B. Grover and Cam Kennedy. And it tells the story of a comic artist named Kenny Hu, who travels from Scotland to Mega City 1 to show off his portfolio and fulfill his dreams of being a comic superstar. Of course, when he gets there, he shows it to the editor at a publishing house called Big One, and he's told that he's not good enough, right? He says any robot could handle this 1,000 of the time. And it's a tough game for humans these days, and to make it, you have to be really special, a real special talent. So Kenny Hu is disappointed, and he goes to a pub to drown his sorrows. And while he's there, he sees this TV screen with an advert of a new artist called Jimmy Hu, who's supposed to be the next superstar. And then he kind of looks at it and says, hey, wait, this is my art, right? Except he didn't draw it, right? It's my style, but it's not my style. And then he's very angry because he thinks that the publisher has stolen his talent. And so he grabs the axe and goes on a rampage to kind of seek revenge. And we will leave Kenny Hu for now and look at my own dreams of being a comic artist, which began sometime in the 1990s. Right, I was back home on holiday in Singapore, and I decided to do my own comic strip. And then I sent it into the newspaper and Straits Times, which are one of the biggest newspapers here in Singapore. And the newspaper at the time were looking for local creators, so they actually hired me to do a daily strip for them, 5 days a week. I think they paid me like $30 a day, which at the time seemed like a lot of money, right? So I started doing this strip, and I was still in school, so I was based in the UK, and I would send back envelopes full of these comics, and you would have to do like maybe a week or two of buffer comics so that you wouldn't, if you ran out of ideas, you fell sick, there would be like a buffer zone that the comic could continue every day. And the problem was that I also was really into politics. And this one is kind of a bit political, but there were others that were like much more so, like this one. This one, Mirabus Man. You probably won't understand it if you're not from Singapore, but this is quite political in its nature. And I remember when I first started doing a comic, they would sit me down and explain to me the concept of OB markers. Anyone here doesn't know what OB markers are? So OB markers, in Singapore, unlike some countries like Thailand, if you can't insult the king, it's like a very black and white line. In Singapore, a lot of laws are not so clear cut. There are things you can't do, things you can do, but then there's this big gray area where things you might be able to do, but you're not quite sure. And then that's when you run against this gray area, and a couple of things you have crossed the line, then you have crossed the OB markers, or what they call outward boundary markers. And once you do that, they'll kind of slap you in the wrist or fine you or something. So whenever a strip like this appeared, it would tell you can't use it, right? So you could have to replace it with another comic strip. And the problem was that there'd be times when there'd be a whole bunch of them that were flagged and censored. And then they would email me and say, we have to replace them. And when I say email, I mean like this kind of email, right? This is back in the early 90s where you go into the computer room and log into your school computer and check email for a few minutes a day. And and in order to replace the comics, you have to send them back to Singapore from the UK. And back then we didn't have Dropbox, we transfer. And to the idea of attaching a big image file to your email was just like completely out of not possible. So instead we use fax machines, which of course produce very jaggedy, low quality images. So the next day when the comics are printed, they'd be like really horrible looking. And after I graduated from school, I came back to Singapore and I found work as an illustrator for a while. And that's when I encountered my first Wacom tablet. And back then, of course, it was hard. Now it's like being sold for $2 in garage sales. And when I first encountered it, I was like, I don't want to use this thing. I was already attached to my mouse, right? So I said, I'll draw everything with my mouse. And I think for a few months, I would refuse to use the tablet. And of course, once I started using it, I realized it was like 1,000 times better than the mouse. So all this stuff seems to suggest that when I first started doing comics, it was almost like a technological dark ages. Like we had no email, no retransfer, all that stuff. But in actual fact, I think by that time the digital revolution was really at least in mid-swing. So if you compare to things that were happening then versus things in the 80s and before, it was really a huge jump in technology. An example of this would be things like this. The color of it is like very lush, very vibrant. You can reproduce comics that are drawn in watercolor, acrylics very well by the 90s and beyond. As compared to comics that were from the 80s, which look more like this, right? So you have very flat colors, very limited palette, and if you look closely, you will see that all these little dots. I think we call Band-Aid dots after someone called Benjamin Henry Day was a printer in Australia way back when. So, so printing is essentially CMYK. Right? I think most of you, anyone knows CMYK RG? Anyone doesn't know about this stuff? So I'm telling everyone this stuff. Right? So essentially, printing is CMYK, and for comics back in the 80s and before, you essentially had to do a very limited set of options. They will allow you to print those dots, right? And then you get these three colors. And you were given the option of using either the full color, 100%, half, 50%, or 25%. So you have three for each dot, and you have to combine them together to produce your full palette. And that allowed you, because of the combinations, to essentially create a 64-color palette. Right? You would use this in order to create the comics. Has anyone ever had to use this in their... Because I've never actually had to do it, because by the time I started doing comics, I was doing Photoshop. Right? So all this stuff I learned from the internet. But it's just, for me it's really interesting, and I find it fascinating, this whole process. Right? So what is involved apparently was that you draw the original art, like twice the size of the printed page. I think you draw large in order to shrink down so that the art looks better when you shrink it down. And then you would Xerox a A4 copy of it as your color guide. And then every artist would have a box of colors, right? One jar to correspond with one of the 64 colors in your palette. And then you would hand paint it, the A4 paper, right, on the side. And then you would have to write down the code for the paper to let the color separatists know exactly what the colors like. Green, for example, is Y2, B2. I think B actually is cyan and should be C, but I think people still use blue because it's more familiar. And then you write out the code so that the people who were doing the separating wouldn't have to guess what color you were using. And then, after this, you send it to the separator and you produce 9 sheets of acetates, clear transparencies, right? 3 for each of the CMYKs. one for each of the percentages between 5, 50, 100%. And using that, they would create a negative for each and combine with the transparency of the black, and then they will create the color printing plates too for the comic. So something like this, right? The black and white color combined and this process. So you can see it's a very hands-on, very tedious process to produce a comic back in those days. Compared with what we have now, so eventually, of course, as technology improved and printing improved, you were allowed to use different percentages of the CMYK, and that created a bigger palette over time. But all this, of course, went out the window when. So I'm going to show you. So these are even more codes, right? As it got more and more complex, we had more numbers to deal with, and eventually we came to Photoshop, Manga. What's that? Manga Studio, right? So nowadays we have these options, and in the past where you had to go to a printer, professional printer to do your comics, nowadays you can just get home and you have a decent computer, a decent program, a decent RAM, and you can do like top quality work at home, and that's been a big change, I think, in comics creation. And it's not just in coloring that this has happened, in lettering as well. In the past, you would have this thing called the ACM Lettering Guide, with which you would create the guidelines for your hand lettering, right? And nowadays, I think we can do the same with computers, right? And not just Comic Sans, but you can even input your own handwriting into a computer, create your own font, and apparently you can even have variations of each letter so that the results look more organic than if you only have one font, one letter per font. And even in something as basic as drawing, I think has been influenced by technology. Like in the past, when as comic artists, you would have a huge library of references from New York City for cars, for planes. Nowadays, you can go online, Google, and search for these things. And even beyond that, you can use like Google SketchUp to rotate your models, right? So, an example of this would be from Dr. Fate, which I did, I think last year. Right? So the image on the left is actually done all in Photoshop. It looks kind of digital. And the one on the right is an ink page from the comic. And you look at the pencils. Okay, so the one on the left is a pencil, but it was actually done also on computer in Photoshop. And I was able to go SketchUp, look for a car model, rotate it, and then superimpose it, and essentially trace the drawing on Photoshop, which of course saves a lot of time and effort in just basic drawing. And then there's the other Charlie Chan called Chai, which is, as I think you mentioned earlier, had some controversy, and part of the whole project, the whole point of it was to create a fictional comic artist called Charlie Chan, because Charlie Chan doesn't exist. So I want to create a fake history of Singapore's comics in order to tell its real history to some degree. And that involved trying to create this fake old comics, right? So I was trying to create comics that this old Charlie Chan was supposed to have created in his lifetime, for his career. And so I had to fake all these old comics. And I would think that before, like 1980s and before, it would take me a lot of work to do this. It's not easy still, but the process was made a lot easier through technology. So throughout the whole thing, I would move back and forth between, I guess, analog and digital processes. Like the thumbnails were all done on Photoshop, and then I would draw it up in pencils. I would scan it in, print out a copy to ink, and also in like real ink. And then of course I'll scan that in and the color on computer. Right? And I could even fake the old Band-Aid dots using Photoshop filters. Right? And then in order to create the old look, I could superimpose a layer of old texture over it to get that sort of wet look to the paper, yellow color look. Which all this suggests that I think to me it feels like we are at a point in time where as an artist you have the good fortune to be able to pick and choose from both the analog and digital world. To me, I still feel like things that you use your hands to draw will feel more organic and more natural. And the trade-off with digital is it's a lot faster and a lot more efficient. And I think we get to choose what we want to do with our own processes nowadays. Like we can say, I prefer to ink digitally or I prefer to ink with a real brush and pen. And all these can come together quite easily using modern technology. So you think of productivity, I think we have like achieved a very high level of productivity as content creators because of all the things that have been created through the internet and through computers and everything else. But I want to go back to Kenny Hu. So this is Kenny Hu who has gone back to complain to the publisher, and he brings him to the room where he finds all these machines who are creating the comics. Right? He says, there are scripts of fed directly from the rehashed banks, and they can draw in any style, line, wash, half-tone, color, you name it. And the pages come out in less than a minute, all fully lettered. And because Kenny Hu says, that's not art. And the guy says, but it's cheap. Right? And he says, why me? You see my art was no good, and the kind of editor admits that actually your art was amazing and unique, but of course then we fed your art into a computer, and now we can produce it with enough input, we can mimic any style. And so, of course, Kenny Hu gets angrier and beats up destroys the machine, beats up the man, and as often happens in these comics, gets arrested and thrown in jail for his efforts. So when I read this comic in the 80s and 90s, if you ask me, would this happen? Would machines ever be able to reproduce comics? I would have probably said yes, but I would have thought it would be like really far in the future, right? When the sun dies out, the heat definitely universe happens. But if we learn anything in the last 10, 20 years, is that a lot of things we thought were going to be very far away are actually a lot closer. There was a time when we thought that chess was a human activity, that computers couldn't beat humans. But if they could beat humans, they couldn't beat Kasparov, right? And of course, Deep Blue came about, and nowadays I think a simple or average program can beat most of the grandmasters out there. And we say that, okay, they can play chess, but can they play Go? Because Go is more intuitive, it's not just crunching numbers. And of course, recently the South Korean best player got beaten comprehensively, and then we said, okay, maybe they can beat him, but they can't beat the best player from China. And of course, he got trounced last month. And then we said, well, okay, you can play chess and play Go, but what about poker, which involves like bluffing and human psychology, blah, blah. And of course, sometime this year, AI trashed a bunch of top players in poker. So you might go in and say, okay, art is different, art is involved drawing, creativity, that's a different level, and you could argue that, and I thought that for a long time until last year when in Facebook a bunch of these pictures appeared from Chris Sung, right? And I looked at it and I thought, this is actually pretty good drawing, right? Even though it's just like an algorithm created this thing. And even this one, it's pretty good. I mean, if I had to produce it in school, I would be pretty proud of that result, I think. So to me, there doesn't seem to be any reason why a bunch of clever scientists got together with artists. They couldn't produce a comic creating machine, right? Which is to feed in enough visual data that it creates an algorithm and you'll be able to churn out these comics. And they might not be the best comics. I think it might be a little bit generic, it might be run of the mill. But it'd be good enough to replace a lot of us, right? So there will be probably some top creators who are so unique or so famous that they would be able to continue their careers. And there will be, on the other end, there will be people who are creating comics for fun, let's say, right? Who don't rely on making income from it, who continue making comics over the long term. But then there's this big middle, right, who will not be able to compete against the speed and the cheapness of AI creating robots in comics. And I think that replicates a lot of what people who write books like this fear, right? That at some point in time, there'll be a big hollowed out middle in the job market where at the top and the bottom you can still survive, but a big majority will not be able to find a living wage anymore. And I think it's coming. I mean, this, okay, so at the top end you see like the ideal picture where computers and humans work together to create a sort of utopia. At the bottom you see the Terminators destroying humanity. And I think that this progress can't be stopped. I think human beings will always seek new technology and advancement. You can't stop that. But I think we also have to be very aware of the human cost involved in what we do. And we should never divorce what we do from the political and social implication of our choices and actions. And I personally don't believe that there'll be utopias or dystopias. I think that human beings are too varied. I think we are both selfish and kind enough that neither of this kind of extremes will ever happen. But we live in a world where we're kind of going between the two extremes in degrees. And it's important that we try to shift the world towards a more humane position as much as we can, because a lot of people are pushing it the other way. Right? And so to all you guys out here who are a lot more into technology, who are actually at the forefront of making these things happen, I would say that I would beg you guys to don't give us Skynet, don't give us the Matrix. Give us a human world where we can actually survive and thrive in this brave new world that we're creating. Thank you.
So we got quite a bit of time to take.
Sorry, it's a bit of a quick talk.
No worries. We got quite a bit of time to take questions.
Running away already.
Let's start with Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter from Denmark. Very inspiring work. I'm very curious about your creative process and this interplay. So there are a lot of people asking questions. So I'll focus on one thing. So you say you switched back and forth between the physical or analog materials and digital and virtual materials a lot.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about how you see those switches? Because in some of the creative practices we observe, a lot of the time people seem to think of them as really annoying breaks in their creative flow, so they have to kind of translate from one medium to the other, and it doesn't really seem to add anything, or at least that's what they tell us. But then sometimes when we try to eliminate those breaks, they find out that they have actually added something, that they were also pauses for reflection that make them rethink what they were doing and so on. I was wondering if you have any comments or thoughts on that, switching between digital and physical throughout a creative process?
For me, I think it makes things a lot faster to do that. I mean, like for me, I used to do my pencils on paper with pencil paper. And when I started doing Dr. Fate, I switched to digital because it was a monthly comic. I had to do 20 pages a month. It's a lot of a very tight schedule. So I decided to try out this digital thing. And it was a lot faster because I could rescale and kind of erase and copy and paste very quickly. So for me, there was, and I think given the way that they design the interface nowadays, there's very little break between. Like you scan something in, it takes you like a minute. Yeah, and so to me, there's no real big gap anymore between switching the two things. The time that you take to do that, saves, the time you save going from back and forth, I think, eliminates any kind of lag for having switched between the two things. And I would say that the main concern for me is still that digital stuff to me still doesn't create the same organic feel that you have with hand-drawn stuff. And even that, I think, the gap is closing, right? I've seen people do inking and comics in computer that looks almost exactly like a brush pen. So to me, it's all been pluses. I haven't seen any kind of negative impact of the switch back and forth.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Sonny. Thanks. I'm the General Chair. Very excited, very honored for you to speak with us today, and I found it really interesting to think about the progression, and having done print work back in the 90s and thinking about four-color separation plates and printing was very interesting. I want to ask you a question though about digital publication, which is to say, like when we were first thinking about inviting you, and Jude mentioned you, and I said, okay, I'll get this book, but I was running between airports, so I actually bought your book on my iPad. And so I'm going through and I see the page and I swipe and it zooms in, and now I go cell by cell, and it was kind of, to me it was a bit weird because I couldn't see the whole construction of the narrative that would be on the page, and I swipe again and it shows me the next page, not the page I just read. So I was getting a little lost trying to consume the book on the iPad. I'm curious, does this come into play when you're thinking about making narratives now, or is that just I shouldn't use an iPad to read?
Okay, so I personally, I'm still a traditionalist. I prefer comic books to digital things. I was as excited as anybody when the Kindle came out. I bought a Kindle. I remember a few ebooks. For comics, I think as artists, at least traditional creators, we look at comics as a page, right? As we say, the basic unit of this design is the whole page. Your composition, your layouts are all factored in when you create that one page. So when things like Comixology zooms into each panel, what they're doing is trying to replicate the feeling of an animation, right? Something that's moving. To me, that creates a problem, I think, because it's sort of trying to turn comics into something it's not, which is an animation. And sometimes you get comics that are partly animated and all that. And to me, that's kind of a very gray area, really. And I feel like we are losing what makes comics unique and just trying to create a mismatch of things.
So do you see it being a new medium then, or a different type of comic, or do you think that it's...
I think you can plan for a different kind of comic. Like these days, you have something called Webtoons, which is a web-based comic platform. And in that format, it's all about scrolling, right? So you would have one panel, scroll next panel. I think that works because it's designed to be that way. But to transpose one thing to the other, I think that's where the problem comes up for me.
Okay. And for the record, I bought your print book here, so...
Brian?
No, you go ahead.
Andrew?
Hi, Andrew from the Interface Ecology Lab. I was just wondering if there are any other stories you could tell us about where you got an important idea from, like how it evolved, where it came from.
Any one idea?
Any.
Well,
That's what we've been
for this
talking
book,
about the last few days.
Charlie Chan of Chai, I was reading books about comics history, like actual comic history books, and I kind of realized that while I was reading it, that whenever I was reading about the comics history, I was also learning about the place where it came from, the country at the time. Like, for example, Robert Crumb's comics in the 1960s were driven by sort of the 1960s revolution in the US. So I kind of thought, okay, wouldn't it be interesting to create a history of Singapore and through its comics history, and then given that Singapore didn't really have a comics history because we don't have a developed industry here, it'd be even more interesting if that history was fictional, right? And then you could create fake narratives, fake art, and then tell the real history of Singapore. And so that kind of evolved eventually into this book. Along the way, all actually just happened. Like, I initially had envisioned it as being pictures with a lot of essays, like those books really are in real life. And then I realized that the books that I had, I'd actually read from page 1 to page 300 or whatever it was. Like, it would never be a linear process. I would just kind of jump in at various points. And so to kind of control the reader's reaction to it, I thought I would draw everything as comics, which, as Scott McCloud did with Understanding Comics, is a way to, if not force, at least compel the reader or kind of make them more likely to read the book in a linear fashion, which is what was required for this book. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. But
That's really great.
Yeah.
That's really nice to hear about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I add on a little? I first met Sonny at a reading of this book, right? And I was seated next to a woman, and it turned out that she was the researcher for this book, right?
All right.
You
Yes,
hired a researcher, and I was like,
it's
what?
just-
A researcher for a comic book? Would you like to say?
Researcher, editor. She whatever I read, she would reread so that she could fact check my claims in the book. And we even had a lawyer to look at it and a historian to look at it, because in Singapore, things can get dodgy if you flout the rules. So you want to make sure that everything was factual, or at least we had evidence to back what we were saying, and we also want to make sure that nothing was libelous, because you get sued unless you're part of the family, as you know. So you went through a lot of research, and because it is about history, I think so. Any book about history has to be well researched.
Brian?
Hi, Sonny. Brian Bailey from the University of Illinois. Thank you for the talk. You described in your talk a future where AI is to be, for lack of a better word, feared. And it would be essentially a replacement for people in the sort of the creative field. I was wondering if you could imagine a future that was a bit more friendly, where agents are your partner, your simulated audience, something that could actually be of benefit as opposed to an adversary.
I can imagine both the good and the bad, I think, but the problem with that is that a lot of people have written about how human predictions are always very based on what they currently know, right? So I think maybe I've seen too many Terminator movies, so I had this sense that it could turn out badly, and it could turn out, like you say, like like the top picture, like everything's working in harmony. But for someone like me who is not into technology, I can only react to what I read in the papers or what people tell me. So I think it's really up to people, maybe like in this conference, who are a lot more savvy with what the cutting edge is. That you guys have to make that happen, right? To make that picture that whatever changes happen is human friendly to some degree. I can definitely picture it, but I have no idea how to bring about this semi-utopia.
Hi, my name is Stephen Dow from UC San Diego. Thanks for that talk. One of my favorite comic artists is Scott McCloud, who wrote a book called Understanding Comics, which is, for those who don't know, it's a book where he explores the medium of comics and explains how comics work through a comics book. And so I was wondering how, kind of thinking about technology, how you think technology has affected how artists use the medium and how they how they communicate through that medium. Has it changed how artists, how the basic form of a comic works, and how sort of, maybe it's partly in the production, I guess you can use more colors and that sort of thing, but McCloud talks a lot about how different frames are broken down and transitions work and that sort of thing. Can you speak to that?
So like I mentioned earlier, I think traditional comic pages will still have the same language. I think whether it's produced in print form or on screen, you still have to worry about composition between panels and the flow of things. Scott McCloud himself, I think, has done a comic where you read the panel inwards, right? So he did this comic on the web where you click on it and you go to the panel and kind of inside that panel. So it's like a never-ending stream of panels within the same frame. I think that was very interesting as a experiment, but I'm not sure how it would reproduce in print, right? So what works on screen might not work in print, what works in print might not work on screen. So I think that there is this divide where if you are focusing on creating comics that make use of all the full tools that the digital world allows you, you would essentially be in a new medium, I think. I think a lot of the old rules that govern what you could not do in traditional comics have to be broken for the digital kind of process. I still, myself, I've never really gone into digital comics as much because I still feel like there's so much more to be done within the traditional realm, right? People like Chris Ware and Daniel Clovis, they've done amazing things in print form, and I think there's still a lot of possibility there to explore, and I'll probably leave the digital stuff to the next generation to kind of create it.
Hi, I'm Kate Quitmeyer. I moved here about 6 months ago, and I've been really excited to find your work. One thing that I was wondering is, do you have any other Singaporean comic artists, especially current ones, to recommend? And failing that, maybe some novels too about current day life in Singapore?
Comic artists, I would say someone called Troy Chin, who's done a series called Resident Tourists. It's all about Singapore life, contemporary Singapore life. An artist called Koh Hong Ting has done a bunch of books about various things like the train station in Singapore, rambutan trees, I think, something like that. Right? So he's done a few books that you can look up at Kinokuniya. Novels I would say, it's my publisher as well, but Epigram Books has done a lot of local books in recent years. If you ask Vincent out there on the table, he'll tell you a whole list of stuff. The one that I think has been getting a lot of acclaim recently was a stories by Amanda Cole Lee called The Ministry of Moral Panic, I believe.
And I have one more quick question. When I was reading your book, I did not realize for a long time that it was a work of fiction. And so you have a lot of paintings that are from photographs and are supposed to be family members of Charlie Chan. Did you get those from actual photographs of period, or were they people that you knew, or where did those come from?
So the photographs were, I recall, they were a bit of a cheat, right? So I had gotten photographs from my family and my friends' families as well. So the one that you see of him in school is taken from a class photo of a friend's father, but I replaced his father with my father's photo, right? So I photoshopped my father's head inside there. So it's sort of a real fiction, I don't know what you call it. It's sort of something like Forrest Gump, I suppose, where you create fake things from real things.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, Sonny.
Hey.
So actually, this is more of a question directed for the local artists because there are quite a number of young guys out there nowadays doing lots of comics, and it's fairly fractured because on one hand you have the people who do print, but there is also quite a number of people doing online comics, and many of them produce comics that are fairly aggressive in tone towards the government, and either they don't know about the authorities or don't care. But typically these are the sort of stuff that gets them a lot of publicity online, and that's the intake for them on social media. So do you see a future where for comic artists here that they are able to bring these concepts and ideas of theirs onto print? Because typically when they try to bring this sort of stuff to the publisher, they usually get rejected because of these OB markers and stuff.
Really? OB markers?
Yes, I think a fair number of them got went over to the publisher and they just outright said no.
Okay. I mean, in Singapore we don't have free speech, like real free speech, total free speech for sure, right? We have some degree of it. We're not as bad as North Korea or China, but we're not as open as the US, clearly. So somewhere in between is where Singapore exists. But from what my impression is that publishers will publish your work if it's excellent quality, right? So I mean, just because you're at the government and sort of angry doesn't mean that your work stands up to sort of a critical scrutiny, right? So I think for creators, we do have the responsibility to try to create works, to at least have good storytelling, right? And I think if you have that and there's a big enough fan base, there's no reason why a publisher wouldn't publish your stuff. It's not, if it's factual, it's not libelous, if it's fact-based, then I really don't see an issue. I mean, the main issue with publishers here is that they want to sell books, and a lot of it's based on whether they think the book will sell, right? As far as I know. Okay, thanks. Okay.
Hi, Sonny. So I'm Alex Quinn from Purdue University. Thanks so much for coming and giving the talk. I was just wondering, like, if you could imagine a future in which you could do the same work at the same quality that you do now in, say, a quarter of the time, would you want to do 4 times as much work, or just do the same amount of work in a quarter of the time?
I'll probably do twice the amount of work so that I have twice the amount of output, but then I have more time for my work-life balance.
All right, so you'd split the difference.
Yes.
So this is actually a 2-part question, and I promise that does not mean 2 separate questions. But if you take just sort of the time that you spend, the time that you spend making your work, I wonder how much of that is kind of new initiative that you have on that day versus how much is kind of replicating skills, techniques that you use on other days. Like if you had a team of clones of you that could do everything that you know how to do, but were subservient to your initiative today, how much would you be delegating to them versus how much is kind of your initiative in the moment?
I would say part of it definitely is quite mechanical. Most of my coloring nowadays is done by someone else. I will send it to a guy in the Philippines to do the so-called color flatting, which is just the flat colors that you apply on. Because that's a really tedious process that I'm no longer interested in doing. And I will go in and replace the colors with ones that I like.
Do you think 3/4? 90%?
Right now, I would say 50. I mean, a lot of manga creators, for example, in Japan, they only do like some difficult drawings, and the rest is kind of farmed out to their assistants. And I have friends in the US who, there's one friend who his father does inking for him. His father's an artist, so he will draw the pencils, email to his dad, his dad will print it out and ink it. So, to some degree, it depends on how unique your style is. Like a lot of Japanese style works because the backgrounds are realistic, so they just have to replicate a style that was realistic. But if you're very unique, quirky style, you might have harder time looking for an artist who can do the same unique look. For myself, I would say that if I could find free clones to do my work, I really wouldn't know what percentage it would be. I'll probably do a lot less work, right? But I'll still do some, because I think part of the joy of creation is the hands-on process of seeing things that don't exist appear almost out of nowhere. So I think I would definitely still be involved in the process, though clearly we all try to be more efficient and more productive whenever we can.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi Sunny, I'm Joel from CMU in the US, but also from Malaysia.
Okay.
So I was curious, kind of bouncing off of Iman's comment about the iPad and how it's sort of you're trying to make comics into animation. I was reflecting on sort of the dominance of 140 character Twitter, the shortening of attention span, the decline of long reads online, and the rise of video on YouTube and Instagram and all these kind of video content. And I was wondering if there was any sort of pressure on the comics community and whether that sort of there's any reaction to the new. So I guess has the audience changed in what kinds of consumption patterns they have? And do you as comic creators, have you responded in any way in terms of the kinds of stories you're telling or the art that you draw and so on? Or is that just kind of insulated from this trend in technology?
I don't think there's insulation for sure. I mean, comic sales have plummeted over the years. Beano, the UK, there was a comic called Beano for Kids. Back in the 40s, I think they would sell 1 million copies per issue per week. Right? Nowadays, I think if you hit 10,000, you're lucky. Right? So in those terms, there are definitely these pressures on sales and what you can do as a comic artist, as a publisher. That I think you can't avoid responding to that aspect of it. At the same time, I would say that I mean, a few years ago, people were saying that print is dead, right? That books are going to go out of print, that e-books are going to take over. But the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen a kind of moving back towards the other direction. People still appreciate having a tactile quality of reading a book, right? And even vinyl coming back for some reason, right? We thought vinyl was dead because of MP3 and all that, but yeah, coming back in a big way, even in Japan. So I think that humans, as long as we can produce books, we produce books. So I think there will always be an audience for traditional publishing, right? And a lot of what you read in papers about comics being the industry suffering is actually just the mainstream industry suffering, like DC, Marvel, superhero comics. That has suffered a lot. Sales have fallen a lot, but that actually gives up what comics are as a whole, because people like Raina Telemaker and a lot of people who are actually publishing within the book industry as opposed to the comics direct market are doing very well. So I think if you look at the bigger picture, you will see that the range of comics that are created nowadays is incredibly diverse, and the audience has grown. Like comics used to be more of a boys thing, now it's like adults, kids, male, female, everyone's reading comics. So there are pressures that definitely push people towards other kind of media and consumption of other things, but I think the diversity of comics also means that we have a wider audience, and also that creators are compelled to create more diverse comics for that wider audience as well.
Hi, Sonny. Neil from City University London. Putting together some of the threads, the answers you gave, what you said in the talk, I get the sense that the new digital technology has helped to make you more productive rather than more creative. I'm trying to get a sense of that balance because I think this is a big issue for this community. Are there examples of new and useful ideas that you developed because of the use of the technology?
Well, okay, so one basic thing is that I think it's freed me up to make mistakes more freely, right? So, like I remember when I was in art school, I would be working on my computer, Photoshop, and I could undo all the Ctrl Z, Ctrl Z, Ctrl Z. Then after that, I'll go to my studio to paint in real life, and then I'll have this instinct to press this Z button that didn't exist in real life. And I think that will, in a way it's good. You have to make harder choices. You have to kind of be more careful about what paint you put on, what color you mix. But it's also a little bit constraining because you're afraid to make mistakes. And I think computers, because of the ease of saving files and going backwards and forwards, gives you kind of freedom to explore things a little bit you wouldn't maybe be as willing to try in real life. The same thing applies to inking. Like, I didn't know how to ink for a long time. Right? So I used to be afraid to ink. And when I have to ink on my own pencils, I'll be very nervous because if I ruin that piece of paper, I'll have to redraw the whole thing and it'll be a lot of work. And nowadays I can just scan it in and print out an A3 version and I can reprint it 100 times. So that gives me sort of, again, the courage to go forward and make those mistakes. Beyond that, I suppose the same thing with coloring. Like, if you were limited to 64 color palette, you'll be making certain choices, whereas you have, nowadays you have the whole big unlimited palette and you can make other choices.
That's interesting. I don't want to cause pain there, as you said.
No, I'm just thinking that, I think, but these are all more like technical challenges. You're talking about creativity in general, like how to create stories. That's a bigger question, and I think that because one thing I noticed when I went to RISD, my old art school last year, was that the students there, they were showing their work to the teachers, and their technical skills had been, but for me, they were a lot more advanced than my cohort when we were in school. And according to the teachers, this has been a trend in the last 5-10 years, and they believe it's partly because they now have access to the whole range of visual influences, whereas we in the past only had like one library to go to, right, or one bookstore. So given the amount of influence they have, I think they've become a lot more technically adept at what they're doing. Whether this extends to like more basic structural storytelling or creativity, that is, I think, it's harder to evaluate. But I do sense that, by giving them access to all these different influences, it does have the potential at least to make them, in a sense, more creative because they are getting so much more input into their brains.
Sounds like a potential paper for CC. Potential paper in 2 years' time.
Hey Sonny, Blake Williford here from the US. I was curious, this is kind of similar to what you were just saying, but curious about your thoughts on art education here in Singapore and abroad. It seems that it maybe isn't always valued throughout the world, and I was wondering if you had any personal experience in that community of educating people to pursue the arts and creativity. Because a lot of people here are educators and are interested in getting people to pursue the arts and be more creative.
I have taught a couple of times for a few years at NTU here in LaSalle, so classes in teaching comics. It's tough because I think at the end of the day we're talking about what artists can earn. I think that's a big thing when people worry about money and savings. I think the arts in general is still behind other industries. Like if you're a lawyer, if you're an engineer, a doctor, and you're pretty good at what you do, you can be quite comfortable in what you earn, right? You can have family, you can buy a house and all that stuff. But if you're a pretty good comic artist or painter, chances are you will not be able to afford what those people can afford. Even you work as hard, you're as talented. So I think there is that gap in what art can earn you. There are obviously outliers, people can earn, like Tim Hurst can earn millions of dollars on his paintings, but as a general rule, I think if you, as an artist, you have to accept that you will be at a lower scale in terms of your earnings. And I think the trade-off, of course, is that you have doing something really love, creativity, as opposed to working in a bank, unless you really love banking. Right? So I think that there is that trade-off that you have to kind of face. And the good thing is that people who love the arts will get willing to accept that trade-off because they do believe in what they're doing. As a teacher, I'm not sure how you. I suppose as a creator, you hope that to some degree, whatever success you have, or whatever things you are able to do, you can, in some small way, inspire them to show that, look, there is this path you can follow. It's not the easiest path, but it is still possible.
Thank you.
Wayne, hi Sonny. Wayne Wu from University of Illinois. So I find it very interesting, like in your talk you mentioned the Prisma technology and it's basically transformed the style of a picture. And actually going over your book, I also noticed like the school has contains so many different styles. So I'm just thinking about what's your thoughts on the kind of potential collaboration between AI technology and this kind of very original and very creative artist. So where the artist's job is not really creating output stories, more about like creating a certain style so other people can sort of have a for example, I can have a portrait of myself just in your style, and maybe for $2. And I'm not saying like that's a very bright future and everybody should go for it. I'm just curious about it. What's your thoughts on this kind of potential possibility? This kind of collaboration with the AI technology.
So you mean like artists work with scientists to create technology that can reproduce art? That's what you're saying?
No, I mean just like a Prisma, like the ones you show in your slides, where like maybe like I can take maybe a picture of myself as an input and some style resource from you, and then can transform me into a portrait of myself in your style. So I mean, what do you think about like working with AI in this way by providing the style? And what's your thoughts? Just
To me, it's very dangerous. It feels like once you do that, you're into this rabbit hole where eventually you will almost be destroying sort of the industry a little bit. I remember when we were in school, an artist came to our school to give a talk about clip art. And clip art is essentially where a company buys over a whole stock of images and photographs and illustrations that they can sell to magazines at a cheap price, and they would go to schools and look for sort of young grads who are hungry and good and talented and saying, well, why don't I pay you like a few $100 to buy your art? And that creates a downward pressure on what you can earn later on, because you companies no longer need to go to Illustrator and pay them money to create new art. You can just buy stock images. So I think this will be similar, right? So if you were the artist who was first approached by some app company, say, what do you want me first to create an app like this, right? And then they pay you some amount of money. So you benefit from that experience, that exchange. But then what happens to the next generation of people who are not involved in that process, right? I think there's a danger that they will lose out in that sense. But again, there's no avoiding, because somebody's going to do it at some point in time, right? So it's a tough choice. I mean, you can't really say no, because it is an earning, it's an exciting new venture. But then what are the consequences? Right? So I think it's important that you do get involved in things like this to talk to the creator, talk to the developers and say, what are the long-term implications of what I'm doing? Right? As opposed to just going in blindly and just hoping that it turn out well. I think we can't predict what will happen, we can't sort of stake out against everything, but we can try, I think, our best to look at the possible consequences and try to be aware of the potential negative impacts.
Thank you.
Hi, Ruben from the Netherlands. One of my works is in the exhibition there in the Art Science Museum. And
which exhibition? Which art piece?
The conference has an art
exhibition. Cool.
Part of the art track. I wouldn't consider myself creative, by the way, but that's another discussion about creativity and art being distinct things. But let's not get into that. I would like to shift the discussion a bit to the second part of your presentation. I found it very interesting. You said a few things that sort of caught me. Because you started your talk, also when you talk, you you showed the comic from 2000 AD. I forgot the exact name of the comic. And in your second part of your presentation, you sort of described a future in which that story there is becoming a reality, actually. And I had to think, actually, about 2 years ago, there were headlines that AI has caught up with Rembrandt, and that there was this Rembrandt being created by a computer. And what struck me there is actually all these news articles, speaking of this, completely ignored the huge amount of human labor that has gone in creating that system, in actually creating that image. It's not a painting, it's an image that looks like a Rembrandt. So what for me is interesting there is that, as well as actually in the example you gave of 2000 AD, that there is always a human in the machine learning loop. There is always the human providing the input to the artificial intelligence, the machine learning. And also, I think 1 or 2 years ago, there was this film script being generated by AI. You might have heard that, you might have seen the film. And what struck me there is that it was sort of very yeah, I think you've seen the film. There was a sort of a very short attention spans, very sort of the cliches on top of each other. And I'm finishing. Don't worry. I'm sort of building the story. Sometimes we need to be a bit more elaborate in our discussions, I guess. So I'm curious here that do you believe your work is sort of computational in the sense that it can be taken over by a computer? And how do you, in your work, sort of position yourself actually in this development that you sketch in the second part of your presentation? How do you see your do you try to take position in that discussion? And if so, how, I'm curious to hear how.
Well, from my own book, I think parts of it can be turned into an algorithm. Like I said, I think storytelling at some level is quite mechanical. You know, you have the whole story structure of the prologue, conflict resolution, epilogue, protagonist, antagonist. All those things can be, they're now computers. You can write sports reports, right? You can put in all numbers and you can generate a report about a sporting event. So there's no reason why you can't do the same with a storytelling. Even if you say it involves human beings at some level in input, but essentially that's still an algorithm that generates a final product. And I think that's a lot of what we do can be reproduced. The question is whether there is still a level of creativity at some level that cannot be done by a computer. And I think right now we assume that it is because we're so used to human beings being creative and computers not. But I don't see why you put enough energy into it, enough money into it, you couldn't produce a machine that could do a pretty good story in comics or any other of the other mediums. The second part, I can't quite remember what the question was. Sorry.
So how do you position your own work in relation to these new developments of generated storytelling?
I don't really have any kind of position to influence things, I think. I mean, I can talk about it in something like this, I can say that we should be careful, but I'm not involved in any of the things. I think I'm not like Elon Musk who can actually putting money into things that affect where this revolution is going. All I can do is really try to create my own stories and hope that they are interesting enough that it shows, it's sort of a proof that human beings still have some edge over the computers at this level. Yeah. Thanks.
I think we have time for one more question, I'm sorry. Right? We want to move, we have a bit of a closing.
Really, it's the only day we've had.
How about we take two questions at once and then we answer?
Seriously.
Okay.
I'll try to be quick and to answer some of the questions that I raised earlier. I'm a collector of his work. They are selling at the gallery. You should bring up more to them. Then you can make your money. So answer some of the early questions. But how are you going to follow this up? Because actually, for those who have not read the comic yet, the vocabulary, the chronological style is very wide. It's about 40, 50 years wide style of Western, Eastern, manga. So now, how are you going to follow up on a work like this without being schizophrenic?
And the second question?
Well, it's more of a think piece. I think we were just getting to the interesting part here about predictability and how this. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Frozen. I've watched it, didn't like it. Heard the story about. I'm trying to speak fast now. Heard the story about how this was actually generated from what you knew that the target audience would like and all these things. So these kinds of predictabilities. So we have a lazy brain, right? Our brain is very lazy. It works on predictability. This is exactly how, if something doesn't fit, that's when we make a reaction. So I would just think that it's kind of going on from Ruben's thing, this thing about how you have to add the unpredictable element, or add something that cannot be calculated. As you said, sometimes a storyline has a mechanical thing. There are rules for what works, what doesn't. And I think maybe this is for creativity and cognition's sake, then this is really important. I have no idea how, I look forward to reading the proceedings because I'm also part of the art track and we've kind of been over there most of the time. I apologize for all the things we haven't heard because we would really like to talk about it. But I think this is a key component to exactly that which you've been talking about, and with some of the questions have been about that there is something that you have to consider, that unpredictability, that things that which doesn't fit.
So I think that that's a good point, and that if it's too mechanical or too mechanistic, then it would be not as interesting. But that's also similar to what people talked about with chess, Go, and poker, like that. There's unpredictability involved. There's games that we can't use AI to play them, but it's been proven that you can input those things into. You can prepare a computer to have sort of planned unpredictability that doesn't exist.
And the kids, a lot of kids really love Frozen, right? So what does that say about? So if we
okay, so I'm not sure exactly about the Frozen process, but I know like places like Pixar, for example, when they plan a story, it's they do have a sort of a formula, but it's not sort of a mechanical thing, right? They would have to pitch the story, and then they would see the reactions from the audience or from the people working at Pixar to see whether they emotionally do respond to the thing. So it is based on human reactions for sure, but that doesn't make it predictable in the way that, let's say, a really bad Hollywood movie that really is going through the motions of storytelling does. So I think something like Frozen, I believe, or any of the Pixar movies, they do look at what people respond to, but in a way that's not mechanical. It's a way to
because the objective is to sell a product, right?
Yes, but I believe at some level that the creators, I mean, maybe not the marketers, but the creators themselves believe that what sells is a good story. Right? So it's about making a good story in order to sell. So you can't have you can have a Transformers example of something that sells but doesn't tell a good story. But for most part, I think most books, most stories do depend on good storytelling in order to be successful. It's not a sufficient condition, but I think it's a necessary condition for the most part that you tell a good story. So I don't think we should look at it in such a cynical manner that all they want to do is sell tickets and make money. I think you have to say that they do believe that in storytelling at some basic level. For the other question about what to do next, it's a challenge. Like I'm worried that my next book will not be as interesting as the current book because I essentially put in everything I knew about comics into this book. Right? Every technique, every style, every idea I had in the last 10, 20 years, I kind of poured into this book. So after that, for a few months, I felt like I was kind of totally emptied out. I think people talk about this a lot in movies, like they direct a movie, they do a play, and they feel kind of like totally emptied out. But so the last year and a half, I've been doing a lot of reading. So I'm trying to reboot my brain. And my next book, I've been telling people, is about capitalism, right? So it's going to be this book about neoliberalism and all those things. And I think that's, for me, it's still a very long journey to kind of understand all these factors. And I think, hopefully, just like, youngsters looking at the internet, I can pour enough in my brain that something interesting will come out at the end of the day, although I can't predict right now what we will be. Thank you, guys.